The fundamental paradox of geophysical monitoring resides in the human tendency to mistake prolonged systemic silence for structural stability. Across the northern coast ranges of California, a 100-mile-long architectural fault line has spent the entirety of recorded human history operating as an absolute stranger to the public consciousness. While academic and popular attention remained rigidly fixed on its famous coastal cousin, the San Andreas, this parallel inland structure has been silently accumulating tectonic strain deep underground. It has not triggered a major rupture in centuries, quite possibly close to a millennium. Yet in the modern observational window, this dormant system has begun to signal. A localized flurry of seismic events near the isolated town of Covelo, punctuated by a record-breaking earthquake on an immediately adjacent fault, indicates a synchronous regional strain. The question confronting modern geophysics is no longer whether this silent giant of the coast ranges is capable of structural failure, but rather if the documented anomalies indicate that the crustal load has reached its absolute physical limit. To evaluate the true scale of this developing deficit, one must analyze the precise data captured by regional monitoring networks. The systemic unrest manifested clearly on a Friday afternoon when the automated instruments of the West Coast Seismic Network recorded an abrupt departure from baseline conditions. At just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, shallow hypocentral ruptures began migrating through the crust north of Covelo, building to a sharp magnitude 4.3 event at a depth of merely 5 miles. Because the energy converted at this shallow depth had minimal distance to attenuate through the crust, it arrived at the surface as a highly concentrated, sudden kinetic jolt rather than a muffled, rolling rumble. Paradoxically, no public countdown or early warning alert preceded the shaking. This operational silence was not a failure of the region's sophisticated earthquake early warning network, but rather a demonstration of its hard geometric boundaries. The system functions by detecting the rapid low-amplitude primary P waves at localized stations and transmitting an alert at the speed of light ahead of the slower destructive secondary S waves. However, for communities sitting directly on top of the active fault zone, the distance to the epicenter approaches zero, causing the primary waves, secondary waves, and telemetry data to arrive simultaneously. Ground Zero receives no head start. The analytical significance of the Covelo sequence lies not in the immediate destructive capacity of a magnitude 4.3 event, but in its distinct structural typology. Seismologists classified the activity as a swarm, a dense cluster of comparable-sized events occurring within a constrained temporal and spatial window without a single dominant main shock to dictate the sequence. Unlike a classic main shock-aftershock progression, where the crust undergoes a singular massive displacement followed by a predictable decaying chorus of adjustments, a swarm represents a volume of rock being actively worked, nudged, and rearranged from multiple vectors at once. This localized instability on the northern sector of the Bartlett Springs fault zone follows a prior sequence from early May, where magnitude 3.5 and 3.3 events struck within 12 hours of each other. The automatic systems caught these twitches in real time, calculating and refining the shifting magnitudes between 4.2 and 4.4 as cross-regional telemetry stations stitched the wave amplitudes together. The instruments reveal a continental-scale strike-slip system, specifically a right lateral structure where horizontal forces drive the opposing side to the right, that is continuously clearing its throat. The core mechanical contradiction of the Bartlett Springs fault zone is its dual physical nature. Surface measurements near Lake Pillsbury confirm that portions of the fault zone undergo continuous fault creep, sliding slowly and imperceptibly at a rate of approximately 3.5 millimeters per year. Geologists have isolated the internal mechanism driving this surface displacement, the presence of sheared serpentinite within the fault gouge. This soft, slippery, talc-related mineral acts as an internal lubricant, allowing upper crustal blocks to glide past one another without locking. However, sophisticated geodetic analysis utilizing satellite positioning networks and interferometric synthetic aperture radar has shattered the comforting assumption that this creep acts as an absolute safety valve. By mapping how the surrounding land surface warps and bends over time, researchers have resolved a profound structural asymmetry. Beneath the shallow creeping skin of serpentinite, deep within the seismogenic zone where major ruptures nucleate, sits at least one massive locked asperity. This jammed patch completely resists the continuous plate motion, storing tectonic energy elastically like a bending stick. Far from neutralizing the hazard, the surrounding surface creep actively concentrates stress precisely at the boundaries of this locked door. Sharpening the structural load year after year, this brings the mechanical equation to its ultimate point of vulnerability, the math of the accumulated deficit. While the shallow chatter of small earthquakes continues, Paleoseismic trenching across the fault scarps has exposed the physical scars of at least 3 prehistoric surface-rupturing earthquakes. Carbon dating of the trapped organic material traces the most recent major failure to a window between 300 and 1,000 years ago. Driven deep underground at a relentless loading rate of 7.5 millimeters per year, the locked asperity has been filling its energy tank completely unhindered by human observation. If the system has held its breath for 500 years, the accumulated slip deficit equals nearly 12 feet of unreleased crustal displacement. If it has stayed locked for a millennium, the stored motion approaches 24 feet. The physical sealing of a 100-mile fault zipper dictates that a wholesale failure of this loaded architecture would unleash a magnitude 7 to 7.5 earthquake, violently destabilizing the region. As the surrounding crust initiates a series of nonlinear adjustments, the critical question remains, are the localized swarms near Covelo merely routine background noise? Or are they the terminal acoustic signals of a locked tectonic door failing under an unsustainable structural load? To evaluate the true threat vector of the Bartlett Springs fault zone, the analysis must expand beyond the architecture of a single structure and dissect the broader geomechanical network of Northern California. The planet's crust operates as an interconnected web of stresses where no anomaly exists in isolation. Just weeks prior to the seismic swarms recorded near Covelo, an immediately adjacent parallel structure ruptured, breaking a regional silence that had endured for 75 years. This neighboring event instantly altered the local strain budget, shifting the delicate equilibrium of the northern coast ranges. When a fault undergoes sudden displacement or even accelerated slow-slip deformation, the release of energy is never entirely localized. The kinetic transition drops the load in one sector only to transfer it directly onto adjacent segments, acting as a regional force multiplier. In a system already characterized by a massive slip deficit, this sudden redistribution of stress onto the locked asperities of the Bartlett Springs zone represents a critical escalation in structural load. This interconnected regional mechanism effectively dismantles the persistent superficial myth that inland fault lines are minor, isolated anomalies secondary to the coastal San Andreas. The total tectonic budget of the North American and Pacific Plate boundary is not consumed from a single fault plane. It is distributed across a broad zone of parallel deformation lanes. The Bartlett Springs Fault represents the farthest inland lane of this macro system, absorbing its own distinct portion of the continental strain. When the public or early civil planning frameworks operating under conventional assumptions dismiss this 100-mile giant as a benign background player due to its remote geography and lack of historic surface ruptures, they commit a fundamental mathematical error. They mistake a prolonged seismic gap, a specific section of an active fault that has remained stubbornly locked while surrounding segments release energy, for a state of permanent structural safety. The physical laws governing elastic strain accumulation dictate that the total energy budget of a locked patch scales linearly with time. The complete absence of a major rupture throughout California's written history is not an indicator of low seismic potential, but rather a metric of an escalating unhedged deficit. When this structural limit is breached, the cascading consequences will trace the physical vulnerabilities of both the natural terrain and the human infrastructure intersecting the zone. Unlike the urban centers along the coast, where decades of engineering codes have braced for the predictable cycles of the San Andreas, the interior geography of the northern coast ranges features a distinct set of systemic vulnerabilities. The 100-mile fault threads directly through steep, deeply dissected river canyons, dense national forest lands, and isolated ranching valleys like Round Valley. A magnitude 7 or higher event nucleating within this shallow crustal zone will radiate severe, undiluted ground accelerations directly into these unstable mountain slopes. The immediate physical consequence will be widespread, large mass-wasting events. Landslides capable of instantly severing the highly constrained transportation corridors, utility grids, and communication lines that serve as the sole lifelines for these remote communities. The human factor in this scenario is defined by acute isolation. The very geography that allowed the fault to remain an anonymous stranger for centuries ensures that a major failure will instantly isolate the impact zone from regional emergency response networks at the microscopic scale. The transition toward failure is dictated by the subtle physics of the rock material itself. The boundary where the velocity strengthening, creeping serpentinite meets the velocity weakening, locked asperity is a zone of profound mechanical friction. As the shallow crust slides continuously at 3.5 millimeters per year, it continuously sharpens the shear stress precisely along the margins of the locked zone, mimicking the physical mechanics of a tear propagating through a sheet of paper. Every minor quake within the Covelo swarm represents a localized microscopic failure, a transient slip event where the rock mass attempts to adjust to this relentless loading. Seismologists utilize dynamic rupture simulations to model how these micro-adjustments can suddenly trigger a macroscopic runaway sequence. If the internal friction of the locked asperity drops below the critical threshold, the rupture will unzip the fault plane at velocities approaching thousands of miles per hour, converting centuries of elastically stored strain into destructive seismic waves within seconds. The persistent chatter of the ground is the physical manifestation of a major tectonic structure, testing its structural limits in real time. The final layer of systemic vulnerability within this geophysical framework involves the precise operational mechanics of human observation itself. Modern seismology relies on a global network of high-resolution instruments capable of mapping the smallest microscopic shifts within the crust. Yet, this absolute clarity of observation introduces a final psychological contradiction into the human component of the system, because scientists can now watch the Bartlett Springs fault zone twitch in real time, cataloging every minor tremor between magnitudes 4.2 and 4.4. There is an institutional temptation to assume that visibility equates to control. This is a profound interpretative error. The ability to measure the precise location and depth of a seismic swarm does not alter the fundamental physical laws governing the underlying stress state. The instrumentation merely documents the accelerating velocity of the load. It does not reduce the structural deficit. The raw telemetry showing a fault zone continuously clearing its throat serves as a diagnostic chart for a patient whose structural limits are being actively overtaxed. This brings the mechanical equation back to the primary physical driver: the absolute limit of the crustal energy budget. When analyzing the alternative narrative that a fault producing frequent small earthquakes is safely venting its energy, the hard mathematics of seismology offer an absolute refutation. The relationship between earthquake magnitude and energy release is logarithmic, not linear. A single step up on the magnitude scale represents an approximate 32-fold increase in the radiated seismic energy. To discharge the elastic strain currently stored within a 12 to 24-foot slip deficit on a locked magnitude 7 asperity, the crust would need to experience hundreds of thousands of small magnitude 3 and 4 events clustered in the exact same location. The minor flurries recorded near Covelo do not represent a safety valve. They are mathematically insignificant drops bled from an ocean of accumulated force. By treating these small events as reassurance, superficial commentary misinterprets the physical symptoms of localized shear failure for systemic relief, ignoring the reality that the deep, locked door continues to hold its breath as the regional stress continues to migrate from the adjacent 75-year-old rupture zone. The systemic consequences threaten to cascade through the macrostructures of Northern California's infrastructure. The physical geography of the coast ranges dictates that all critical networks, including high-voltage transmission lines, regional aqueducts, and fiber optic telemetry arrays, must cross these parallel fault systems at high angles. A sudden horizontal displacement of several meters along the Bartlett Springs zone would instantaneously sever these linear corridors. The human factor is thus exposed to a compounding crisis. The immediate loss of structural integrity in local valley communities like Covelo will occur simultaneously with a broader regional network collapse. Because the shallow nature of the fault ensures that the kinetic energy arrives at the surface undiluted by distance, local civil infrastructure will be subjected to maximum peak ground accelerations with zero warning time. The failure of the physical structures is intimately linked to the failure of the logistics networks designed to sustain them, transforming a localized geological event into a self-reinforcing macroecological crisis. Ultimately, the documented history of the Earth remains the only verifiable baseline for future behavior. The paleoseismic scars stacked beneath the valleys of Mendocino County serve as a physical ledger of structural limits previously breached. The Earth does not operate on a human calendar, nor does it negotiate with human economic dependencies. It responds exclusively to the balancing of its internal energy budgets. The current combination of an enduring seismic gap, a massive slip deficit accumulating at 7.5 millimeters per year, and an accelerating series of regional swarms indicates that the Bartlett Springs architecture is approaching a transitional phase. The long-term stillness of this inland giant was never an indicator of stability, but a mask for a loading mechanism that has operated relentlessly through centuries of human silence. As the automated arrays continue to track the minor acoustic signals of the crust, they are documenting the final, nonlinear adjustments of a system that has run out of structural reserves and is preparing to balance its long-overdue debt. The structural integrity of a geophysical boundary is ultimately evaluated by its worst-case scenario. When the deep, locked asperity on the Bartlett Springs fault zone reaches its physical boundary limit, The resulting dynamic rupture will propagate along the 100-mile structural corridor within a window of seconds. Seismologists utilize high-fidelity numerical models to simulate this precise structural failure, tracking the kinetic energy as it converts centuries of elastically stored strain into a high-velocity rupture front. In a full-length failure event, the rupture tears through the crust like a high-speed zipper, unzipping the rock mass along the parallel lanes of the coast ranges. Because this fault performs its mechanical work within the shallow upper 5 miles of the crust, the energy cannot disperse or dull over distance. The resulting peak ground velocities will hit the surface with undiluted sharpness, generating severe horizontal displacements that will immediately test the structural limits of every engineered and natural system in the region. This physical reality directly shatters the alternative narrative that a remote fault zone presents only a localized risk. In a highly integrated macroeconomic network, a catastrophic structural failure inside a remote corridor triggers a nonlinear collapse across the wider systemic geography. The primary mechanical impacts will be concentrated in communities like Covelo, where the close proximity to the fault line nullifies the capabilities of early warning telemetry. Houses, municipal structures, and local tribal assets will experience sudden violent multi-axis accelerations before any automated network can transmit an alert. Simultaneously, the surrounding terrain will experience widespread slope failure. The steep, heavily timbered ridges of the Mendocino National Forest will transform into vast landslide corridors, burying the thin mountain roadways under millions of tons of debris. This physical mass wasting immediately isolates the impact zone, cutting off ingress for heavy rescue equipment and preventing the egress of injured populations, forcing a completely localized human crisis under conditions of total infrastructural blackouts. Beyond the immediate impact zone, the physical interconnections of the regional utility networks ensure a broader cascading collapse. The high-voltage transmission lines that supply energy from northern generation facilities to the urban centers of the state span these inland mountains at high angles. The sudden right lateral displacement of the ground by multiple meters will instantly shear the foundations of these heavy steel towers, severing the grid and triggering large-scale electrical imbalances. Simultaneously, regional aqueducts and fiber optic data arrays threading through the interior canyons will undergo catastrophic structural failure at the fault crossings. The human factor at the macro level shifts from localized survival to regional crisis management, as major metropolitan areas hundreds of miles away experience sudden supply deficits in water, power, and data telemetry. The silent giant, by breaking its long-held seismic gap, demonstrates that a remote geographical boundary is a physical illusion. The entire state is anchored to the mechanical stability of these inland mountain blocks at the microcomponent level. The physics of the transition from stable locking to catastrophic slip reveals why the system is so highly unstable. As the adjacent parallel faults continue to shift their stress loads onto the Bartlett Springs zone, the internal pore fluid pressures and frictional properties within the locked asperity undergo rapid degradation. The velocity-weakening rock mass, once breached, experiences a total breakdown of internal resistance, allowing the opposing sides of the fault plane to violently accelerate past one another. The minor swarms recorded throughout the year are the visible alerts of this internal friction being actively tested. The paleoseismic ledger dug from the earth confirms that this system has balanced its energy accounts through this exact style of violent macro rupture at least 3 times in its past. The massive slip deficit, piling up silently at a rate of 7.5 millimeters every single year, stands as an unyielding physical invoice. The long historical silence was never a guarantee of safety, but the slow, patient accumulation of a debt that the crust is now preparing to collect. The true boundary of any geophysical risk model is reached when scientific observation runs out of history and must confront the absolute limits of the system itself. The state of California operates on a standard assumption of seismic preparedness, yet its public safety architecture is structurally optimized for the historical cadence of the San Andreas. By relying on a brief window of written documentation spanning less than 2 centuries, human administrative planning has constructed an entire narrative of regional safety around a profound sampling error. The hard physical laws of paleoseismology, extracted directly from the trench sediments of the northern coast ranges, explicitly deconstruct this myth of safety. The Earth's memory, archived in the offset layers of charcoal and organic debris, demonstrates that the Bartlett Springs fault zone operates on a much longer temporal architecture. The system does not reset its strain budget simply because human observers are not present to record the loading at the systemic level. This temporal mismatch exposes the fragile relationship between long-term geological cycles and short-term human infrastructure. The 7.5 millimeters of horizontal displacement driven into the crust each year cannot be erased by institutional indifference. When the geodetic models resolve a major locked patch underneath the shallow creeping serpentinite skin, they are identifying a structural engine that has been continuously gathering energy for anywhere from 300 to 1,000 years. This means the system is currently withholding a massive elastic slip deficit of up to 24 feet. To assume that the fault will continue to deform through silent, harmless surface creep is to ignore the fundamental physics of velocity-weakening friction at depth. The creeping sections are not neutralizing the system, they are actively driving the locked asperity toward its terminal mechanical threshold. The localized swarms near Covelo, combined with the recent record-breaking rupture on the adjacent fault segment, provide clear empirical evidence that the entire regional stress field is actively reorganizing. The human factor in this final equation must confront the sobering limits of technical protection. The earthquake early warning networks, while highly sophisticated, are fundamentally constrained by the physics of wave propagation and the geometry of shallow epifault ruptures. For the communities built directly along the 100-mile line of the Bartlett Springs zone, the arrival of the destructive secondary S-waves will remain entirely synchronous with the initial primary waves and any automated telemetry. The system provides zero head start when the user is standing precisely on top of the moving zipper. When structural failure occurs, the sudden horizontal lurch will instantly sever the internal corridors of the coast ranges, creating a self-reinforcing loop of physical isolation, utility blackouts, and localized mass wasting along the unstable mountain valleys. The macroeconomic networks of the state will find their water, power, and data lines abruptly disrupted at the inland fault crossings, transforming a remote geological anomaly into a widespread structural crisis. The final conclusion delivered by the Bartlett Springs fault zone is one of mathematical inevitability. A system driven by relentless plate tectonics cannot store energy indefinitely without eventually breaching its material boundaries. The hum of small magnitude 3 and 4 earthquakes recorded by modern instruments is not the safe release of steam, but the acoustic signature of a heavily loaded structure approaching its physical limits. Seismologists continue to run dynamic rupture simulations not as an academic exercise, but to map the inevitable boundaries of the wreckage before the fault plane unzips in reality. The long historic silence of this 100-mile inland giant was never a state of equilibrium but a prolonged seismic gap waiting for its closing window. The Earth does not adjust its physical limits to accommodate human timelines or economic assumptions. It moves exclusively to balance its energy budgets. As the regional strain continues to accumulate, the silent giant in the mountains remains locked, patient, and